Don't regret letting go of someone you love, the ache that has no name. There is a kind of pain that does not fit inside any category the world has given you. It is not the pain of being left. It is not the pain of anger or betrayal or hatred. It is something far more disorienting. It is the pain of walking away from someone you still love, completely, deeply, without any part of you having stopped. And the strange, cruel thing about this particular pain is that the world does not know what to do with it. People understand heartbreak when you were abandoned. They understand grief when someone is gone. But when you are the one who chose to leave, when you made a decision that cost you everything, there is very little space for your suffering. Because from the outside, it looks like you are in control. It looks like you made a choice. And choices, people assume, come with peace. But you know the truth. You know that making the hardest decision of your life does not make the pain smaller. Sometimes it makes it larger, because layered on top of the grief is something even heavier. The question, the one that follows you into sleep, that surfaces in the middle of ordinary moments, that whispers at the back of every quiet room. Did I make a mistake? That question is what brought you here. And before anything else, before any explanation or reframe or insight, you deserve to hear this. What you are carrying right now is not weakness. It is not confusion. It is not a sign that you made the wrong decision. It is the inevitable weight of having loved someone completely and choosing yourself anyway. That is one of the most difficult things a human being can do, and most people never find the courage. This is not a video about how to stop missing someone. It is not going to tell you that time heals everything, or that you will find someone better, or that everything happens for a reason. Those things may be true, but they are not what you need right now. What you need right now is to understand. To understand why you left even when love was still there. To understand why the pain you feel is not proof of a mistake. To understand that letting go of someone you love is not a betrayal of that love. It is sometimes the truest and most honest thing love can ask of you. There is something that lives between the decision and the peace. A space that no one prepares you for. And in that space you will find guilt, longing, second-guessing, and a grief so specific it almost has its own texture. You are living in that space right now, and by the time this journey is over, you will not be free of the feeling, but you will understand it. And understanding, even when it does not remove the pain, changes everything about how you carry it. Stay with this, all of it. You are not broken. You are someone who loved with everything you had, and that is exactly why this hurts as much as it does. Why loving someone was never enough. You were taught somewhere along the way that love is the answer, that if two people love each other enough they can make anything work, that love is the foundation, the solution, the force that overcomes every obstacle. And you believed it? Because why wouldn't you? It is the story every song, every film, every fairy tale has been telling since you were old enough to listen. But here is what no one tells you. Love is real. Love is powerful. Love is one of the most extraordinary things a human being can experience. And love, on its own, is not enough. That sentence lands hard, because it feels like a betrayal of everything you were taught. But think for a moment about what love alone cannot do. It cannot create safety where there is chronic anxiety. It cannot build trust where patterns of deception have worn it away. It cannot make two people compatible when their deepest values, their visions of life, their emotional needs, point in completely opposite directions. Love can be present in all of those situations, fully, genuinely present, and still be unable to fix what is structurally broken. This is one of the most painful paradoxes of human connection. You can love someone and be wrong for them. You can love someone and be unable to give them what they need. You can love someone and recognize in your most honest moments that who you are together brings out versions of yourselves that neither of you are proud of. That the dynamic between you, no matter how much tenderness exists, creates more pain than peace, more confusion than clarity, more distance than true intimacy. The world rarely talks about this kind of love. The love that exists alongside incompatibility. The love that is real and insufficient at the same time. Because it is easier to believe that love either conquers everything or was never real to begin with. But you know from the inside of your own experience that neither of those things is true. You loved them. That was never the question. The question was whether love alone could sustain something that needed more than feeling to survive. And somewhere inside you, in a place deeper than desire, you found the answer. Not the answer you wanted. The answer that was true. Most people spend years, sometimes entire lifetimes, waiting for love to be enough, holding on, adjusting, shrinking, hoping, believing that if they just loved more, tried harder, became more patient, more understanding, more flexible, the relationship would finally become what they needed it to be. And in the waiting, they quietly lose themselves, piece by piece, so gradually that they almost don't notice. You noticed. And that noticing, however painful it was, is not something to be ashamed of. It is a form of clarity that most people never allow themselves, because allowing yourself to see the truth means you can no longer pretend. And pretending, as painful as it is, at least feels familiar. The love was real. The love was not enough. Both of those things can be true at the same time. And holding both, without collapsing one into the other, is where your healing begins. The moment you knew. There was a moment. You may not have named it at the time. You may have pushed it down, rationalized it, explained it away with logic or exhaustion or hope. But it was there. A quiet, unmistakable signal that arrived not from your mind, but from somewhere deeper. A place that does not speak in words, only in certainty. It might have come during an ordinary conversation that suddenly felt hollow, or in a silence that stretched too long and revealed something neither of you could say out loud. It might have arrived in the middle of a moment that was supposed to feel good, a trip, a celebration, a quiet evening, and instead felt like standing behind glass, watching a life you were not quite living. Or it came in the exhaustion after a fight that was not even about what it was supposed to be about, when you realized you were no longer fighting to fix something. You were just fighting. That was the moment. The moment your inner knowing arrived before your mind was ready to receive it. And the tragedy is not that you had that moment. The tragedy is what most people do with it. They ignore it. They medicate it with distraction. They reframe it as fear, as cold feet, as a bad week, as temporary. They tell themselves that every relationship has hard seasons, that feelings are not always reliable, that they should not throw away something real just because of a feeling. And all of those things are partially true, which is exactly what makes the inner knowing so easy to dismiss. But here is what psychology and lived human experience consistently reveal. That inner knowing, that quiet, persistent signal, is not random. It is not anxiety. It is not simply fear of commitment or discomfort with vulnerability. It is the accumulated intelligence of your entire experience with this person, processed at a level beneath conscious thought, arriving as a feeling before it can be articulated as a reason. Your nervous system registers things your mind has not yet named. It tracks patterns of safety and unsafety. It notices when your authentic self is consistently welcomed and when it is consistently shrunk to keep the peace. It observes when repair is genuine and when it is performative. It feels the difference between a temporary rupture in a fundamentally healthy dynamic and a fundamental incompatibility that keeps wearing the same temporary costume. And when it has gathered enough information, it delivers a verdict. Not loudly, not dramatically, quietly, persistently, in the form of a knowing you could not fully explain to anyone else because it did not arrive with evidence you could lay on a table. It arrived as truth. You felt it. And then at some point, you honored it, even when it was the hardest thing you had ever done. Even when every part of your emotional self was screaming for one more chance, one more conversation, one more reason to stay. The fact that you listened to that knowing, the fact that you did not let fear of pain keep you permanently attached to something your soul had already recognized as finished, is not something to second guess. It is something to understand. because that voice does not speak without reason, and it does not go quiet just because you try to silence it. The myth of the perfect goodbye. Somewhere in the imagination of everyone who has ever had to end something they loved, there exists a version of the goodbye that would have made it all okay. A conversation that finally said everything. A mutual understanding. A hug that held all the years between you. A parting that felt somehow complete. A closure that arrived like a gift and left both of you at peace. That ending, for most people, never comes. And so they carry the real ending. The one that was messy or cold or unfinished or said too much or said too little. And they measure it against the imaginary one. And the distance between those two endings becomes its own source of pain. They wonder if they could have done it differently, said the right thing, chosen a better moment, been kinder, cleaner, braver. As if the right words delivered in the right way would have transformed the loss into something both people could peacefully set down. But here is the truth that almost no one tells you about endings. There is no goodbye that removes the grief. There is no conversation that perfectly explains a love that has reached its limit. There is no parting that leaves both people feeling fully understood, fully honored, and fully at peace, because loss does not work that way, because the other person will always experience the ending through their own pain, their own history, their own needs, and no matter how thoughtful or gentle or honest you were, you cannot control how the ending lands in someone else's heart. This is the myth of the perfect goodbye, the belief that if you had only said it differently, the pain would be smaller, that if the other person had understood, you would feel less guilty, that if there had been more closure, you would not still be turning it over in your mind at 2 a.m. But closure is not something another person gives you. It is something you construct, slowly, honestly, imperfectly, within yourself. It is not a moment. It is a process, and it does not require the other person's presence, understanding, or forgiveness to begin. The ending you had, however it unfolded, was real. It was yours. It was human, and therefore imperfect, and therefore exactly what it was always going to be. You cannot go back and deliver it more elegantly. You cannot rewrite the last chapter of a story that has already been told. What you can do is stop measuring what happened against an ending that was never possible. What you can do is recognize that the messiness of the goodbye does not diminish the love that preceded it, and it does not define the integrity of the decision you made. You are not a better or worse person because of how it ended. You are simply a person who had to end something, and endings, even necessary ones, are never clean. The peace you are looking for will not be found in rewriting the goodbye. It will be found in accepting the one that actually happened, and in understanding that imperfect endings are the only kind that exist, because imperfect is the only kind of human there is. What guilt is really telling you. Guilt has a particular weight. It is not sharp like anger, or hollow like sadness. It is heavy and persistent, like carrying something you cannot put down because you have convinced yourself that putting it down would be wrong. And for many people who have chosen to leave someone they loved, guilt is the companion that refuses to leave, long after everything else has begun to settle. But before you accept guilt as truth, you need to understand what guilt actually is. Because guilt, as a psychological experience, is not always a moral signal. It is not always the voice of your conscience telling you that you did something wrong. Sometimes, particularly for people who were raised to prioritize others' emotions above their own, guilt is a conditioned response. It is what happens when you do something for yourself in a system that taught you that your needs are secondary. Think about what you learned about relationships, about love, about your role in the lives of people close to you. Were you taught that a good person sacrifices? That love means enduring? That leaving is selfish, even when staying is slowly destroying you? Many people carry these beliefs without ever examining them because they arrived early, quietly, and were never challenged. And so when you finally do something that prioritizes your own well-being, when you make a decision that is true for you, even if it is painful for someone else, the old programming activates. It tells you that you are selfish, that you gave up, that a better person would have stayed, tried harder, loved more. And you feel guilty not because you did something wrong, but because you did something you were never fully given permission to do. You chose yourself. That is a profound distinction, and it changes everything about how you relate to what you are feeling. Guilt also serves another function that psychology has long recognized. It keeps you in relation to the person you left. As long as you feel guilty, you are still connected, still thinking about them, still carrying them, still in some way responsible for their pain. And for people who are deeply empathetic, for people who feel other people's suffering as if it were their own, guilt can feel preferable to the alternative, because the alternative is separation. And separation, for some people, triggers an even deeper fear than the guilt itself. This does not mean you are manipulative or dishonest. It means you are human. It means the guilt is protecting you from something, from the finality of the loss, from the silence that follows when a relationship truly ends, from the disorienting freedom of no longer being responsible for someone else's emotional world. The guilt is not lying to you, but it is not telling you the whole truth either. It is telling you that you care, that you are empathetic, that you take seriously the impact your decisions have on other people. Those are not flaws. Those are the qualities that made you someone worth loving. But they are not reasons to return to something your soul already knows is finished. Feel the guilt, understand it, and then gently let it speak to you about what it is really carrying. Not a verdict on your character, but a window into the depth of your heart. The version of you that stayed. Close your eyes for a moment. Not literally, if you are watching this, but in the way you close your eyes when you are honest with yourself, and imagine the version of you that stayed. The one who pushed the feeling down one more time, who had one more conversation that changed nothing, who decided that the love was enough reason to remain, even when everything else was telling you otherwise. Where is that person 1 year from now? 2 years? What does their face look like when they are alone? What do they do with the things they have stopped saying? What happens to the parts of themselves they have learned to keep quiet to preserve the peace? This is not an exercise in judgment. This is not about whether staying would have made you a weaker or a worse person. It is about honesty. Real, unflinching honesty about what remaining in something past its truth costs. Not in dramatic ways, not all at once, but in the slow and almost invisible way that prolonged self-abandonment works. Because when you stay in a relationship that is no longer right for you, when you override your inner knowing, silence your needs, and adapt yourself continuously to maintain a connection that has already reached its natural end, something happens to you that is very difficult to see from the inside. You begin to disappear. Not your body, not your name, but the parts of you that are most alive. Your curiosity, your lightness, your instinct. The version of yourself that exists when no one is watching. Those parts do not leave loudly. They retreat slowly. They learn that there is no safe space for them here. And eventually, you forget what it felt like to be fully yourself, because it has been so long since that person was welcome in the relationship. You start to call this maturity. You call it compromise. You call it love. But underneath those words, if you are honest, you recognize it for what it is. A version of yourself that has learned to survive by becoming smaller. And the painful thing, the thing that almost no one talks about, is that this erosion feels normal after a while. You adjust to it the way you adjust to chronic low-grade pain. You forget that it was not always this way. You forget that there was a version of you who did not have to think twice before speaking, who did not manage their emotions carefully before entering a conversation, who felt at home in their own presence. The version of you that stayed would have continued to adjust, would have continued to find ways to make it work, to hope things would change, to love harder as if love alone could transform a dynamic that needed structural change, not more devotion. And slowly, quietly, that version of you would have given away the most essential parts of themselves, in the name of a relationship that was, at its core, no longer capable of holding them. You did not stay. And the grief of leaving is real. but so is the cost of what staying would have required you to give up. Both truths deserve to be held at the same time. How love can exist outside of a relationship. There is something that no one prepares you for when a relationship ends. The love does not stop. It does not disappear at the moment of the goodbye. It does not dissolve because the relationship has. It sits there, inside you, persistent and real. And because you no longer have a container for it, it can feel like the most disorienting thing in the world. You wonder, if I still love this person, how could leaving have been right? How can the feeling still be this present if the decision was real? But what if love was never meant to only exist inside a relationship? What if the love you feel, right now, in the aftermath of the ending, is not evidence that you made a mistake, but evidence of something far more profound about the nature of connection itself? Love, in its truest form, is not a transaction. It is not conditional on proximity, on shared space, on daily conversation. Love is a recognition, a deep acknowledgement of another person's soul, their humanity, their complexity. And that recognition does not require a relationship to exist. It does not require you to be together or in contact or even in each other's lives. It simply is. It persists. It transforms. When a relationship ends, what ends is the structure, the shared routines, the plans, the future you had imagined together, the specific form that the connection had taken. But the love, the actual essential thing beneath all of that, does not end with the structure. It finds a new shape. It becomes something quieter, something less demanding, something that no longer needs to be managed or maintained. It becomes, for many people, a silent form of care, a wish for someone's well-being from a distance, a gratitude for what the connection brought, even in its ending. This is not a romantic notion. This is a psychologically and spiritually real phenomenon, and recognizing it changes the relationship you have with your own grief. Because if love can exist outside of a relationship, then the love you feel right now is not holding you back. It is not a reason to return. It is simply love in its truest, most undemanding form. Love that has released the need to possess, to control, to maintain. Love that has matured into something that can wish someone well from the other side of goodbye. There is a particular kind of peace that becomes available when you stop trying to kill the love in order to justify the ending. When you allow yourself to say, I love this person, and I am not going back. Not because the love is gone, but because love, on its own, was never the only thing that mattered. And because the most honest thing I can do, for both of us, is to honor the ending, even while the love remains. That is not weakness. That is one of the most emotionally sophisticated things a human being can do. The identity you lost, and the one you are building. When a relationship becomes a significant part of your life, it does not stay separate from who you are. It enters you. It shapes the way you move through the world, the way you see yourself, the language you use to describe your life. Your identity, the story you tell about who you are, becomes interwoven with the story of the relationship. With we. With us. With the version of yourself that existed inside that specific love. And so when the relationship ends, something that feels like more than a person is lost. A version of yourself goes with it. The self that was known in a particular way. The self that had a place in someone else's world. The self that had a role, a history, a future, all mapped out in a specific direction. That self does not simply relocate when the relationship ends. It dissolves. And in the space where it used to be, there is something that can feel terrifyingly formless. This is one of the most underestimated aspects of relationship grief. People expect to miss the other person. They do not always expect to miss the version of themselves that only existed in relation to that person. They do not expect to feel, after the relationship ends, like they do not quite know who they are anymore. Not in a dramatic way, but in the quiet, disorienting way of waking up in a life that no longer has the shape you had grown accustomed to. The psychologist Dan McAdams described identity as a narrative, a story we construct to make sense of our lives. And our most significant relationships become chapters in that narrative. When a chapter ends, especially one that was central to the story, there is a period of not yet knowing how the next chapter begins, of standing between who you were inside the relationship and who you are going to become outside of it. That in-between space is uncomfortable. It is not empty. It is full of possibility, but it does not yet feel like anything you recognize. What you are experiencing right now, beneath the grief and the second-guessing and the guilt, is the beginning of a reconstruction, not a return to who you were before, because you cannot unknow what you have known, cannot unfeel what you have felt, cannot go back to a version of yourself that existed before this love changed you, but a new construction, one that integrates everything you have been, everything you have learned, everything this relationship revealed about your capacity for love, for depth, for endurance. The identity you are building now is not lesser than the one you lost. It is deeper, because it is being built by someone who knows what it costs to love fully, by someone who has walked through grief and kept going, by someone who is learning, perhaps for the first time, that their sense of self does not have to depend on being someone's partner to be whole. That person is already emerging. You may not be able to see them clearly yet, but they are there. In every moment you choose honesty over comfort, truth over convenience, growth over familiarity. They are being assembled in the quiet, in the hard days, in the moments when you choose to stay with yourself rather than run back to something finished. Why your mind keeps rewriting the story. There is a phenomenon that psychologists have studied extensively, and that almost everyone who has ended a relationship recognizes the moment it is named. It is the phenomenon of the edited memory, the way the mind in the aftermath of loss begins to selectively retrieve the past, pulling forward the warmth, the laughter, the tenderness, the specific moments that felt like proof that what you had was irreplaceable, while quietly allowing the harder memories to recede into the background. You remember the trip where everything felt perfect. You remember the way they laughed at something only you would understand. You remember how safe it felt in their arms during a particular night, a particular storm, a particular version of your life that felt briefly, beautifully right. And in the midst of those memories, the reasons you left can start to feel blurry, abstract, smaller than they once did. And the question arrives, did I exaggerate the problems? Did I give up on something that was actually good? This is not nostalgia. It is a cognitive pattern called rosy retrospection, and it is one of the most powerful and disorienting features of the grieving mind. The brain, when processing loss, tends to idealize what has been lost, partly as a protective mechanism, partly because painful memories are processed differently than pleasant ones and take longer to integrate. The result is a version of the past that is not dishonest exactly, but profoundly incomplete. You are not misremembering the good things. The good things were real, but so were the other things. The moments that left you feeling unseen, the patterns that repeated no matter how many times you addressed them, the version of yourself you had to suppress to keep the peace, the quiet exhaustion of trying to be loved in a way that always required negotiation, the feeling, not once but consistently, that something essential was missing. Those things are also real, and the mind in its grief tends to minimize them, because acknowledging them means acknowledging that the ending was necessary, and necessary endings are painful in a particular way, because they do not give you the relief of having been wronged. They only give you the weight of a decision made in full awareness without the comfort of blame to simplify it. When your mind rewrites the story, gently rewrite it back. Not harshly, not as an act of self-protection through cynicism, but with the same completeness that the actual story deserves. The relationship was real and imperfect. The love was genuine and insufficient. The good memories are true, and they are not the whole truth. You can honor what was beautiful without using it as evidence against yourself. The story of what you had, held in its full complexity without idealization and without demonization, is the only version that will actually set you free. The hidden weight of staying too long. Most people, when they think about a relationship they should have ended sooner, focus on the obvious things. The arguments that escalated, the incompatibilities that became undeniable, the distance that grew between two people who were once close. But there is another dimension of staying too long that almost no one talks about, one that is quieter, more intimate, and in many ways more damaging than any of the visible signs. When you remain in a relationship that your inner knowing has already recognized as finished, something begins to happen beneath the surface. Not all at once, not dramatically, but with the slow and patient inevitability of water finding its way through stone. You begin to distrust yourself. Each time you override the signal, each time you know something is wrong and choose to stay anyway, each time you talk yourself out of your own perception, each time you accept less than what you needed because leaving felt too frightening, you send a message to the deepest part of yourself. The message is, I will not listen to you. My comfort with the familiar is more important than your truth. And over time, that message accumulates. It becomes a habit of self-distrust, a reflex of second-guessing your own instincts, a pattern of minimizing your own experience in order to preserve something external. This is the hidden cost of staying too long. Not just the time, not just the missed experiences or the deferred growth, but the erosion of the relationship you have with your own inner voice, the gradual undermining of your confidence in your own perceptions, your own needs, your own judgment. The slow learning that your signals are not to be trusted, when in fact they were the only thing that was telling you the truth all along. Many people who have stayed too long in relationships that were not right for them carry this particular wound into the relationships that follow. They second-guess their instincts. They override red flags. They minimize their own discomfort in the name of not wanting to repeat the mistake of leaving. Because leaving the last time was so painful and so questioned that they resolved, somewhere beneath conscious awareness, to never trust that feeling again. You left before it could take everything, before the self-doubt became permanent, before the erosion reached the parts of you that are most essential. And the fact that leaving hurt as much as it did, the fact that you are still questioning yourself, still carrying the weight of the decision, is not evidence that you made a mistake. It is evidence that you had just enough trust in yourself left to act on what you knew, even when what you knew was the harder path. The self you are recovering is not only the self that existed before the relationship. It is the self that was slowly returned to you the moment you chose honesty over comfort. That recovery takes time, but it is already underway. Grief is not regret. This might be the most important thing you hear in this entire video, so let it arrive slowly and let it settle before you move past it. Grief is not regret. They feel similar. They live in the same emotional neighborhood. They both involve pain over something that has ended, something that is no longer here. And because they feel adjacent, the mind often collapses them into one, treating the grief as evidence of regret, using the pain as proof that the decision was wrong. But grief and regret are profoundly different things. Grief is the natural, inevitable response to loss. It is what happens when something real and significant, something that mattered, something that shaped you, something that held a version of your life, is no longer present. Grief is not a signal that you made a mistake. It is a signal that you were fully present for what you had, that you allowed yourself to love without reservation, that the connection was real, and its absence is real, and your heart is responding to that reality with the only honest language it knows. Regret, by contrast, is the belief that you should have chosen differently, that a better version of you, a wiser, more patient, more courageous you, would have made a different decision. Regret is future-oriented in a particular way. It imagines an alternate timeline in which you stayed, or tried harder, or said something different, and that alternate timeline looks better than the one you are in. But here is what that imaginary timeline always forgets. It forgets the cost. It forgets the version of you that would have slowly disappeared inside a relationship that was no longer right. It forgets the years of adjustment and suppression and hoping. It edits out all of the reasons the relationship had reached its end, and presents you with only the warmth of what you are missing, which is not the full story. The pain you feel is grief. It is the honest response to real loss. And grief has a particular quality that regret does not. It moves. It is not static. It does not require a verdict on your past to resolve itself. It simply needs time, presence, and the willingness to feel it without immediately trying to turn it into a lesson or a reason or a justification. You do not have to justify your grief to make it valid. You do not have to prove that the relationship was bad enough to deserve this much pain. Love does not require a threshold of dysfunction to be worth grieving. The connection you had was real. Losing it is real. And the grief is the appropriate, honest, fully human response to that. Let yourself grieve without using the grief as evidence against yourself. The pain is not telling you that you were wrong. The pain is telling you that you loved, and that love, even the love that ends, even the love that requires you to walk away, was worth every moment of what it cost. What the connection was really teaching you. If you step back, far enough back to see the entire arc of the relationship, from the beginning through the ending and into the place where you are now, something becomes visible that is very difficult to see from inside the middle of it. A pattern, a curriculum, a set of lessons that this specific connection, with this specific person, at this specific moment in your life, was perfectly designed to deliver. That is not a mystical idea. It is a deeply practical psychological one. Every significant relationship we enter, especially the ones that cost us the most, brings us into direct contact with the parts of ourselves that most need attention. The unhealed wounds that shape our choices without our awareness. The patterns we repeat because they are familiar, even when familiar means painful. The places where our capacity to love outpaces our capacity to maintain healthy boundaries. The beliefs about our own worth that were formed long before we ever met this person. The relationship you are grieving was not only a relationship, it was a mirror. And mirrors, even when what they show us is uncomfortable, are one of the most honest and useful things available to us. What did this connection reveal? Perhaps it showed you the pattern of giving more than you receive, and helped you finally see that this pattern did not begin with this person. Perhaps it brought you face to face with your fear of abandonment, or your need for approval, or your tendency to silence your own needs in the presence of someone else's pain. Perhaps it revealed the places where your self-worth was conditional, where you needed to be chosen, needed, loved, in a particular way in order to feel like enough. These are not comfortable things to discover, but they are extraordinarily valuable. Because the moment you can see a pattern clearly is the moment you can begin to change it. The moment you recognize that the pain of the relationship was pointing at something real inside yourself, not as blame, but as information, is the moment the relationship begins to serve you even in its ending. This is what it means to say that some connections are meant to transform us rather than last forever. Not in a way that dismisses the depth of what you had, not in a way that reduces the person you loved to a lesson you were meant to learn, but in a way that honors the full complexity of human connection, the way we find each other for reasons that are not always visible until later, and the way the ending of something can carry just as much meaning as the beginning. You are not the same person you were before this relationship. Some of that change happened because of the joy it brought, and some of it happened because of the pain. Both forms of change are real. Both are yours. And both are pointing you even now in the direction of someone you are becoming. Someone who is wiser, more self-aware, more honest about what they need and what they can offer. Because of everything this connection required you to face. The person you were before you loved them. Before the relationship existed, there was a version of you. A self that had its own rhythms, its own instincts, its own way of moving through the world. A person who wanted particular things, felt drawn toward particular experiences, held particular dreams that had nothing to do with anyone else. A self that perhaps you have not spent much time with recently. Because one of the quietest effects of a long or intense relationship is that the self before the relationship becomes gradually obscured. Not erased, it never fully disappears, but layered over. Your preferences begin to accommodate another person's. Your time organizes itself around someone else's presence. Your sense of who you are starts to be defined, at least in part, by your role in the relationship. Partner, companion, the person who loves them, And before long, the self that existed independently of all of that becomes harder to access. Not because it is gone, but because it has not been needed in the same way. Now, in the aftermath of the relationship, you may find yourself in a strange and disorienting position. There is space where there used to be another person, and in that space, for the first time in a long time, the question is fully yours. Who are you when you are just yourself? This question can feel terrifying, especially if you have spent significant time in relationships, or if your sense of identity has long been tied to being in relation to someone. The silence of being alone with yourself, really alone, not waiting for someone to return, can feel enormous, too large, like a room with too much air in it. But it can also, if you are willing to sit with it long enough, begin to feel like something else, like space, like possibility, like the first quiet moment in which you can hear your own voice clearly, without it being filtered through what someone else needs, expects, or desires from you. The person you were before you loved them is not the person you will return to. You cannot return to who you were before, and you would not want to, even if you could. Because that person had not yet loved this deeply, had not yet learned what you have learned, had not yet walked through the particular kind of fire that leaves you different on the other side. But beneath the changes, beneath the grief and the growth and the versions of yourself that the relationship created, something original remains, something that was yours before any of this began, a way of seeing, a set of things that genuinely matter to you, a sense of what makes you feel alive, desires that were set aside, not abandoned, dreams that were deferred, not destroyed. They are still there. And in the quiet that follows the ending, if you are willing to be still enough to listen, they will begin to speak again, not as they once did, but as something that has survived and perhaps grown stronger for having been held in reserve. Permission to move forward without explanation. At some point in the aftermath of leaving, you may notice a particular pressure building, from the people around you, from the questions they ask, from the way they look at you when you try to explain. And sometimes the pressure does not even come from other people at all. It comes from inside. From the belief that before you can truly move forward, the decision needs to make sense to everyone involved, that you owe an explanation comprehensive enough to satisfy every person who loved what you had, or who is grieving the loss of the couple you were, or who simply does not understand how you could leave someone who, from the outside, seemed right for you. And so you find yourself trying to explain, trying to translate a decision that was made at a depth that language cannot fully reach, trying to compress a complex, layered, deeply personal truth into a narrative that will satisfy the listener, even when the listener is not you. But some decisions cannot be fully explained, not because they are wrong or impulsive or cowardly, but because they were made in a place inside you where reason and feeling and instinct and accumulated experience all met simultaneously, and the verdict that emerged from that meeting is not reducible to a list of reasons that can be handed to someone else and understood from the outside. You do not owe anyone a complete explanation of why you left. You do not owe anyone an account of your inner life that is satisfying enough to justify your decision to people who will never have access to the interior experience that made it. You do not need consensus. You do not need approval. You do not need the person you left or your mutual friends or your family or anyone else to understand, fully, completely, without reservation, why this was necessary. You needed to understand. And you did, imperfectly, incompletely, in the way that all real self-knowledge arrives, not as a perfect answer, but as a truth you cannot argue yourself out of, no matter how hard you try. There is a particular freedom that becomes available when you stop seeking external validation for an internal decision, when you release the need to make your choice legible to everyone who is watching, when you accept that the people who love you most may not fully understand this, and that their inability to understand does not make you wrong, that you can hold the decision with integrity, even when no one else can see the full landscape that it was made from. You are allowed to move forward, not when everyone understands, not when the guilt is completely gone, not when you have said every word that needed to be said and received every acknowledgement you deserve, But now, as you are, with the decision behind you and the rest of your life in front of you and the truth, quiet, unshakable, yours, somewhere in the center of your chest, where no one else can reach it. You do not need permission from anyone else. This is it, the love you owe yourself. Finally, you have arrived at the place this entire journey was building toward, not a place of certainty, because certainty is rarely what grief offers. Not a place where the pain is gone, because some things take longer than a single sitting, but a place of understanding, a place where the pieces of what happened can be held together, without collapsing into either self-blame or self-justification. And here, at the end of this road, there is something that needs to be said to you directly, something that does not need to be dressed up or softened or delivered carefully, something that is simply true. What you did, the act of letting go of someone you loved even when love was still present, even when the grief was already waiting on the other side of the decision, was an act of self-love. Perhaps the most difficult form of self-love there is. Not the easy kind, not the kind that looks like rest or pleasure or kindness. The hard kind, the kind that requires you to hold your own truth above the comfort of the familiar. The kind that says, I see what is here, and I see what it costs me to stay, and I am choosing myself. Not out of selfishness, but out of a deep and honest recognition that I cannot keep pouring from a place that has run dry. That is not giving up. That is not cowardice. That is not a failure of love. That is the rarest and most courageous form of love. The love you extend toward your own life when everything else is asking you to stay small. The love you had for the person you left when that was real. Let it be real. Honor it not by returning to something finished, but by allowing it to have changed you in the ways it was always going to change you. By carrying it, not as a wound, but as evidence of your own depth. As proof that you are someone who does not love casually, who does not connect without meaning it, who does not walk away without cost. And now, the love that is most needed is the love that turns toward you. The love that says, I will not punish myself for the rest of my life for a decision my soul made with everything it had. The love that says, I am allowed to grieve and still move forward. I am allowed to miss someone and still know that leaving was right. I am allowed to be both in pain and at peace with the same decision, because truth does not require the absence of sorrow. You are not broken. You never were. The grief is not the evidence of your damage. It is the evidence of your humanity, of a heart that is still fully alive, still feeling, still capable of being moved by what it has lost. And that heart, the one that is aching right now, is also the heart that will love again, not as a replacement, not to fill the space, but because love is what you are made of, and no ending has ever been able to take that from you. The life that is waiting for you is not a consolation prize. It is not what is left after something better failed. It is the life that becomes possible when you stop pretending and start living in full alignment with who you actually are. It is the life built on the foundation of a decision that cost everything and was worth it. You chose yourself. That was not the end of love. That was the beginning of the most important love story you will ever live, the one between you and the person you are becoming.